Hello. So here we are with part 4 of the console rebuild. I'm kicking off with just doing a bit more cleaning. So the first thing we're going to do today is actually remove the meter bridge and remove the core of the console off the stand, and then we're going to start working on the stand. Fortunately, it was mostly dust and dirt inside here. No dead animals, no spiders, so it was just a matter of not getting my face covered in dirt once I actually removed that console off the stand. Here we're starting to look at the meter bridge, so I'm marking up the cables so I know where each cable will go back. This ended up being pretty futile because it's quite a simple construction, and I really didn't need to do this, but better to be as safe as possible, especially at this point. So, slowly removing all the connectors. Once we've got this done, then as you can see, it's removing quite some significantly long metal screws from the bridge that are connecting it to the back of the console. This took a little while. Once again, the screws were extremely long and quite corroded in there, so you can see me struggling with that just a little. And we are pretty much loose, so off it comes. The strip that fell away there is pretty much just to stop vibrations from the back of the console and the meter bridge while I'm working on it. So time to remove the major part of the console where all the buckets are and everything. It is extremely heavy. I didn't even realise how heavy this was going to be. It doesn't look like it. It looks like it should be fairly light, but it's not. And especially with a huge piece of oak on the other end. And I probably should have left both sides on. Without that big oak panel, there's nothing really to give the metal any rigidity, so it just flexes like crazy, which is not what you want. So I hadn't planned this very well, and I had to move the major part of the stand out of the way to be able to put the console up against the wall and continue working on the rest of it. And there we go. You can see once again how many cables are still connected to this base of the unit. So time to remove the last part of that drawer. Do you remember that drawer from the first episode that, I guess it was there for the engineer's notes or something? But anyway, it always irritated me, and it was a good moment to actually finally get rid of that. Once again, look at the size of that screw! So the good news is the main part of the support structure of the base is held together with those hex nuts, similar to what you get at IKEA, but obviously a bit higher quality. And very fortunately, they haven't showed any corrosion, so they've held up really well, and you can see they're actually quite simple to take out and not giving me too much trouble, especially considering I'm using such a small hex key to get those out. So you'll hear me sighing a lot as I'm doing this work. This is only, I think, the third day that I'd had the console, and I've been working pretty much non-stop for those 3 days, and we've got a whole side off. So even the side, even that piece there is amazingly heavy. So the rest of the hex nuts have to come off. We're almost there, and you can see now. This is normally where you remove the last piece, everything falls to the ground, makes a hell of a lot of noise, and I just didn't want to deal with that, especially when I'm inside the garage. So, time to start cleaning up the base, and what we're going to do is we're going to sand down parts of it. Some of it's got corrosion on, as we saw earlier, and some of it just needs a key to the surface, so a bit of roughing up of the surface to allow some new paint to actually adhere and stick really well. So once again, this is the feet of the console that the feet of that one leg of the console that I'm trying to remove, and these were quite rusted, if you remember once again from part 1. So they took a bit of work to get off. You could see I was having to rotate the actual leg, and not so much was I able to rotate the bolt itself that was holding the leg on. So I'm using some wet and dry here to get rid of the corrosion. The feet were the worst part. The major part of the leg, and especially the struts that hold the main part of the console. They were in pretty good condition, but I still wanted to make them look as good as new, so they all got pretty much this exact same treatment and a respray. Now, once again, we were on the tail end of summer here, so it was still quite a hot day. I think it was in the mid-30s. So these parts dried out really fast. I was able to work pretty fast this day. And yeah, I completed this whole part of the project within that day. So you can see I'm resting the parts up against the garage in the sun, so they dry out super quick. And then straight on to the next part. And pretty much it's just the same time and time again. So once we've got all that done, it's now time to put some pre-paint on the part. So this actually removes any grease or any dirt that's still built up on there. And then all I'm going to do is use that rattle can you can see in front of me, and very carefully put paint on. Now, if you're ever using rattle cans and you're getting runs and things like that, the trick is, as you can see there, you just spray the parts very gently. They'll build up over time. It does use a bit more paint, and it's not as enjoyable as really flood filling the paint straight on. But if you do it carefully, the end result normally is absolutely amazing. So now on to the second leg, exactly the same thing again, a bit of pre-paint just to clean it up, let that wick off, that dries really fast, and then spray away. Looking back on this, it didn't seem like there was this much fumes and paint coming off at the time I was doing it, which is why you should always use a mask. Now, I'm recording this on the 19th of April 2020, and right at the moment, if you need to get a mask for anything, it is impossible. And here we are, the end of the day, and all the paint is dry. It looks really good. It seriously came up so much better than I'd expected. You just sort of need to give it 24 to 48 hours to really harden onto the surface. But yeah, I couldn't have been happier. So what I'm using here is just some vinegar to actually remove the rust on all the bolts that came off the stand. The bolts themselves are in good condition, they're just a bit rusty on the surface. And here's the stand once it's been reassembled in the studio. I'd later rearrange everything, but yeah, we're ready to really get back to putting those strips together. So we tore down the strips in the last episode. Here you can see me just removing the dust and grime that's off the surfaces there. So what I'm going to do here is just spray down the main parts of the board with some isopropyl alcohol, and then just use the toothbrush, as you can see there, just to get the worst of the dirt off. Now, there's a few schools of thought on contact cleaner and when to use it and when not to use it, and some people say never to use it. The rule I use is, unless if I'm cleaning out the pots themselves, like going inside and getting rid of the build up inside the pot, then for me it makes a really good mild solvent and gets rid of the worst of that dirt. So you can see that washer? That's going to come back to haunt me. Oh wow, that came back to haunt me a few times. I'll tell you a bit more about that in a few moments. So now on to the EQ module, pretty much exactly the same. I'm taking the chance, like I said earlier, that I'm just reconstructing these channel strips, not troubleshooting them at this moment. So I'll give them a clean just to make sure I'm not putting grime back into the strips. But yeah, I'm not going to go any further and, you know, test the values of the potentiometers and look for scratchiness right at this time. The one thing I did do though was there's a lot of interconnects on the boards for the EQ and quite often for the microphone pre. I just sort of cleaned those up with, once again, a mild solvent and just a bit of, I think that's a Scotch-Brite pad. So it just, you know, gets rid of that problem before it actually becomes an issue. So finally, time to start the reassembly. This is the very first channel that I rebuilt. It's looking so much better than I thought it would. It looks brand new. There's a bit of scratching on the sides of the strip, but obviously once it's back in the bucket, you're never going to see that. Now, remember I told you about these washers. So every one of those potentiometers should have a washer on the back of it. So not on the front, not where I'm going to put the nuts on to hold everything in place. No, it should be on the back. So I'm going to go through pretty much a majority of a rebuild on this strip and then realise I have to take it all off and start again. As you could imagine, I was a little frustrated by that point and I didn't bother refilming it. So we'll go through it. The process is exactly the same, but you put some washers on first before you start assembling. You can see there I've just reconnected the EQ module and now it's time to screw things in. Now the mic pre that I'm playing with there, that's actually got some nice captured nuts in it, so it's really easy to screw that back together. The board underneath, you actually have to manually put the nuts in place and then hold the nut in place and then actually screw the screw into the top of the nut. You'll see in a minute that was extremely difficult to do. You cannot get your fingers in there, so I had to use all kinds of crazy tools and try and sort of fabricate things. Now, the interesting thing is, of course, as I did more of these strips, I got better at doing it. I found little tricks. I found that I could hold the nuts in place with other methods, but right at the moment, I spent probably half an hour for 3 nuts and screws. So you can see here I first tried using a magnetized screwdriver to hold the nut in place, and I sort of very gingerly held that under the hole where the screw was going. No, that didn't work. That was just a terrible idea because it kept falling off and it frustrated the hell out of me. So here's try number 2. I'm holding the nut from the bottom end and trying to screw into the top of it. This worked, but some of these screws go in right in the middle of the board. There's just no way to do that without ripping out the EQ module and then sort of trying to flex everything to get the EQ module back in. So you can see here I'm using a paintbrush with a bit of blue tape holding on the nut. So finally got those in. Now it's time to reinstall the VCA. There's 2 parts to the VCA there. The main board on the bottom is the VCA itself, and then there's a little daughter board that clips in that you can see there with the green transistor array on it. Something of note is that transistor array, so that little green piece of plastic, I cannot find a source for those to replace one. So one of the strips is unfortunately not working, and it just doesn't seem to be a single source to actually buy those little packages anymore. So once again, just using some contact cleaner just to make sure the interconnecting cables are as good as they can possibly be before I start troubleshooting. So here we are reattaching the switch. This was pretty easy, just 2 screws. And then this is sort of where I broke my own rule that I just didn't want to tear down every one of these switches. It's normally not successful with these types of switches anyway, but I thought I'd give them just a bit of contact cleaner, move them around. Really by design they're a bit self-cleaning anyway, but yeah, just give them a real clean just to make sure they're as good once again as they can be. So time to reinstall the actual fader module. This is upside down, so basically the blue label should be facing the other way. I'll figure that out in a moment. And as I'm putting it in, I'm noticing it just doesn't seem right. There are 2 little nylon washers, little white nylon washers that should be on each end, and it just gives it a bit of relief away from the main metal part of the actual strip and allows the fader to move really smoothly. I think I figured out just around this moment, and hopefully I should come back any moment and go, aha, this is what I should have had. And there we go. That's what should have been there. So once again, it's a bit tricky to actually get these on because you've got to put the screws in, then put the washers in, then very carefully hold the fader in place the correct way around this time, and then really carefully, hoping not to upset anything, screw it all into place and pray that it all sort of holds together and you don't have to chase those washers and chase those screws too many times. So reconnecting the fader to the VCA and then putting the VCA amplifier module back in, and we're pretty much there. All I've got to do at this point is put the hex bolts back on to hold the potentiometers in place. Once I've got those, put the actual knobs back over the top of each one of those potentiometers, and we're good to go. Oh no, this is where I realised I had to tear it all apart again. Anyway, so I won't make you sit through that as I promised. You can see I've put the bolts back in place, I've rebuilt the strip, and now all I'm doing is putting the knobs back on. Aligning the knobs is a little tricky. You have to make sure that they sort of line up to the correct places against the potentiometer, so you sort of have to move all the potentiometers down to their 0 positions and then make sure all the knobs are pointing in exactly the right direction. Then I'll use the tool that I created in the last episode, I think, and slowly actually torque them down so they work correctly. You put the little caps on top and pretty much you are there. So you can see here a cap that I aligned incorrectly. I'm using a guitar pick just to slip under the cap to actually pop it up. That way I minimise the risk of actually chipping that cap and ending up having to try and source a replacement, which is not cheap. So last part, and we have the first of 20 console strips all done. So next time we'll start actually rebuilding the console, we'll take a look at the power supply, and we'll actually finally start to power things up. Until then, I hope you enjoyed this episode. Thanks for watching.